Uh, you can
Yeah,
just
just
do me or
stay.
just keep me there.
Hi.
It's fine.
Hi, this is Jennifer LaRue. I'm the Director of Public Programs at the Mark Twain House and Museum in Hartford, Connecticut. And what an evening we are in for this evening. Going to be talking about beauty and flowers and what they mean. And we've got two delightful guests, Jessica Roux and Cindy Brockway, to share all their knowledge about this subject with us. We've got people from all over the country here tonight, and from the chat, I can tell people are really looking forward to this, as am I. Um, I want to just welcome you to Crowdcast, and some of you may have used it before, some of you may be new to it. So I just want to point out some of the things that are going on here during the program. The chat is live. It's been live for ever since we set this event up, and it will continue to be live even after the program is over. So if you make friends with somebody on here, you can come back and chat with them anytime you like. The program is being recorded, so you'll be able to watch it at your leisure anytime you want after tonight. If you know, chat in the chat. But if you have a question for the Q&A, I'd ask that you please post that question down in that Ask a Question area at the very bottom of your screen. That makes it a lot easier for us to keep track of the questions, and also allows you to upvote, so that if you go in there and somebody else has already posed your question, you can just click so that that question gets 2 votes or however many it gets, and that makes it a little easier too. And having said that, I want to take a moment here to introduce our executive director, Peter Bruce. Peter, you want to say a few words?
Sure. It's such a pleasure to have you both here tonight. I really appreciate you doing this for us. We've had a really successful run with all of these crowdcasts, and so this is just the next episode, and it's a thrill to have you here as fall comes down to think about wonderful summer colors. But I also want you to think about the fact that while this program is free to you, it is not free to us. As every small business today is having problems, we are too. We have had to lay people off. Those of us who remain have taken salary cuts just in order to be here. So there's a big green button underneath. And we would urge you to think about giving us a donation for this. This is going to be a great informative session, and think about it the same way you would going to the movies, and please give us a donation. And the other thing I'd like to mention, and another way to help us out, is that we are going to have a fantastic virtual gala on November 6th. And we have guests from all over the place, and our presenters include Ron Chernow, who wrote Hamilton, and David Baldacci and John Grisham and Jodi Picoult, who spoke for us last night, and Sophronia Scott and Christina Greer and David. David. I said David Baldacci. We also have Brad Paisley and Jimmy Buffett, who will be playing for us as well. So it's free to sign on for that, and I encourage you, please come and see that on November 6th. And have a great session tonight. I'm looking forward to watching it.
Thank you so much, Peter. I'm going to let Peter go into the audience so he can relax and enjoy his evening, and we'll see you in a little bit. So Peter mentioned our gala, which I hope you all will find a way to join in. That and all of our other programs you can learn more information about on our website, which we call marktwainhouse.org. So go check it out. I also would tell you that all of these Crowdcast programs are featured on our website. So you can go back and look at this one on our website along with all the other ones that we have offered since April. So there's a lot of rich material there that you might enjoy. Speaking of rich material, tonight's going to be such a lovely conversation. We have with us tonight Lucinda Brockway. She's the Program Director for Cultural Resources at the Trustees. She leads a team of cultural resource specialists seeking innovative solutions for cultural sites ignited by the unique legacy of each property. Brockway facilitated the curation of landscape research, planning, and investments in 3 national landmark sites owned by the trustees: Naumkeag in Stockbridge, Castle Hill in Ipswich, and the Old Manse in Concord, which included rethinking the role of house, collections, landscape, and ruins for public engagement. So welcome, Cindy. And Jessica Roux is a Nashville-based illustrator, author, and plant and animal enthusiast. She loves exploring in her own backyard and being surrounded by an abundance of nature. Using subdued colors and rhythmic shapes, she renders flora, fauna, and many other things with intricate detail, reminiscent of old world beauty. So I can't wait to hear what the two of you have to say. Audience, please join me in a virtual welcome for Cindy and Jessica. And I'll be back on at the end to help with the Q&A.
Terrific. Well, thank you all so much for joining us tonight. And I am so thrilled to be able to interview Jessica tonight. It's just a treat for me. I felt like I got the first book hot off the press when I ordered my copy. And it was a real delight when it came in the mail. And Jessica, I just have to say, you're just an amazing artist, just beautiful, beautiful illustrations. And if any of you have not had a chance to see this book, I urge you to get it. It's wonderful, not only for yourself, but also for gifts and for inspiring gifts in this age of pandemics when we're all trying to be as creative as we can about our family and friends and our own lives and our own pocketbooks. So I really do think it's a beautiful, beautiful book. So congratulations on the publication of the book.
Yeah, thank you. I really appreciate it.
Is this your first publication?
It's it would be my first book. Mm-hmm.
Fabulous.
Yep.
Can you tell us a little bit about the story behind how you wrote this book and designed it so beautifully?
Sure. I came to write and illustrate Floriography because I've always really loved drawing, love writing. I actually spent my first year in college studying journalism and taking nonfiction classes before I transferred to the Savannah College of Art and Design to pursue illustration. And so it was there where I first learned about the language of flowers. I tend to focus my work on nature. I draw a lot of plants and animals. And a professor in school actually told me about the language of flowers. She mentioned it as a way to start incorporating into my work to try to convey more complex moods or concepts in the work. And so while I was looking up flower meanings to use in my work, I found a lot of really cool and interesting things. But what I really wanted to know was why. Why would a pansy mean you occupy my thoughts? Why would ferns mean secrecy? And so I started doing my own research really into the whys of it, because it's pretty easy to really find a list online of a flower name and what it would mean in the Victorian era. But it was much more difficult to really find information about the why of it. And because I really love drawing flowers and I love doing that kind of research, it really just became a passion project for me.
Mm-hmm. You know, the trustees operates a museum called Fritland's Museum in Harvard, Massachusetts. And given the pandemic and how hard it's been to get everybody into a gallery space, we launched an exhibit on another woman artist named Polly Thayer Starr. And she's famous for saying that she wanted to see the invisible within the visible. And I wonder if you can tell me, because it feels like her art and your art are so similar in the ways that you really bring the flowers to life in this book. And I'm sure you probably do the same with the animals, which is, she was a portrait artist, but she really loved nature. And so did a lot of drawing with that. So can you talk a little bit about how you awaken the invisible within the visible when you're doing a drawing of a daffodil or a rose or a pansy?
Sure. So when I first start drawing something, I tend to look at reference photos, like old lithographs and that sort of thing. And I try to really capture the mood or the feeling behind it. And so if you look at a flower like baby's breath, you know, you have like really fine, tiny details. And so to translate that into an illustration, you kind of you draw what should be there, but what might not be visually there. And so you kind of tend to sort of imagine how it would translate to be recognizable stylistically, but still sort of be realistic enough to be recognized as what it is. And so there are certain ones where flowers that I draw where you take certain liberties, but you still try to keep things like the right number of petals or the right number of leaves or the leaf shape into consideration. And so I know with some of these flowers, it's really hard to just find a photo or even in my own garden to try to see just a single stem with a flower on it alone and how it would be sort of composed. And so I know with some of these, I'll pull up a couple.
That'd be great.
Yeah, so, you try to make a curved stem, which, might not be there if you pluck that straight out of the garden, especially hellebore, which tends to be a little bit bushier. But you can kind of visualize it in a way where it's like, oh yeah, I've seen that flower before. But I don't have to draw an entire bush that's more zoomed out. I get to focus on the little tiny details, which is what I really like to do in my work.
Well, it sure shines through, and I've never seen such beautiful pictures of hellebores and pansies. And
Thank
do you
you.
have a favorite illustration of everything that's here? It's funny because I expected when I interviewed you tonight, I'd be seeing a whole group of vases with flower specimens or nature specimens behind you, and I see a little bit on your
Yeah,
mantle
there's a
back
little
there.
close jar back
It's a
there with
cabinet
some,
of curiosities for you.
yeah.
So do you have a couple of favorite illustrations that you truly, truly love that think are some of your best work? If you had to
Oh,
pick any for me, it
definitely.
would be like my favorite children, I think.
I know it is really hard. I can definitely tell you what my least favorite are, which is kind of
Okay.
more interesting. But if I had to pick an absolute favorite, I really do love in the bouquet section. We have the bouquet for bitter ends. I just think it's visually so interesting. We get more spiky flowers and we get like thistles, we get big flowers, some small flowers. So you get lots of variation in size and in shape. And so that one is petunias for anger and resentment, datura for deceitful charms, tansy for hostility, thistle for misanthropy, and wormwood for bitterness. So it's kind of a fun one because it's a little bit more mean, but you get kind of more visually interesting flowers. And so I loved putting those together. And then in terms of the flowers themselves, there's so many that I like. Every time I flip through, I feel like I find a new favorite. This one's a great one, the chrysanthemum.
Gorgeous.
Anytime I get to add like a lot of little tiny details like that, I feel like it's a lot more fun.
If you get a chance and you're not very far away from Pennsylvania, and if the greenhouse is open, the Longwood Gardens does 1,000 bloom chrysanthemum. So I can't imagine somebody like you who goes down to such detail for every single flower being so overwhelmed by a plant that has 1,000 blooms of chrysanthemums on it. So picture that
Yeah.
1,000 times over. Pretty amazing.
That would be incredible.
For people that are in the audience that don't know much about the history of floriography, can you give us a little background and history as to why this was such a trend, both in the Victorian era and why you think it's so relevant now?
Sure. I have a little bit of research pulled up here next to me because I can't remember dates to save my life.
It's okay.
But it sort of originated in Turkey. They had a sort of language of flowers called selam, and which actually means like hi or hello. It's a greeting. And it was a mnemonic language rather than an emblematic one. So it differs a bit from the Victorian language of flowers. So an example that you see often is that pear would rhyme with despair. And so that would be sort of how it would go versus like the Victorian language of flowers where you have roses mean love. So it's more of a symbolic thing. And so that was popular in harems and in courts in Turkey. And there are the Turkish embassy letters that were written by Mary Montagu. So she was writing about them in 1717. And so it really didn't catch on as its own thing until almost 100 years later when we see Les Langages des Fleurs, which was written by Charlotte de la Tour in French in 1819. And so she created her own flower dictionary. And only a year later, it was translated into English and started spreading throughout Victorian England. And the language of flowers really started taking off. It was a culture where flowers were important, but it had started to industrialize. And so there were less green spaces, less parks, and less land than there were in previous times, like in the 1600s, when you would have like the tulip bloom and that sort of history. And so with floriography, it was practiced a lot by women in high society. It was seen as something that you would have to know about. It would be a topic of conversation when you would go and visit a friend. And so you would also practice it in fashion. A lot of times you would carry a bouquet or like a tussie mussy with you, which is a bloom or two, kind of in a small bouquet that you could carry with you or give to someone else. And so it really became popular and the trendy thing to do in that time period. And it really starts fading away when we see the signs of the First World War. Essentially, flower production was really not something that needed to be prioritized. We needed to focus on growing food. And so that sort of thing made it fall by the wayside. And so now it seems that people are getting more into it again. People have more time on their hands now than they ever have before with the pandemic. I noticed more of my friends gardening and baking and kind of doing those more domestic tasks that they might not have time for if they're spending an hour commuting in traffic. And I also think that with the world today, it's really nice to appreciate and see the beauty in flowers. And so, you know, with the wildfires going on right now in Australia earlier this year, I think people are realizing that with the climate emergency that's happening, we want to live in a world that has flowers, right? So I think people are starting to understand and realize the importance of the beauty in the natural world. And I think part of the way this book makes it really digestible is that you have an illustration, a full-size one on one side. You've got like the meaning, the origin story, and some suggested pairings. And so it's not something that you need to sit down and spend a lot of time reading in one sitting. It's something that you can pick up and put down. Pick it up when you start feeling down about the world around us, you know, and hopefully it can like shine a little bit of light back in.
I think that's totally true. It's a little bit like a recipe book. When I looked at it, a recipe for your day, however you're feeling, then you could figure out how you would like to put things together and how you'd like to make those happen. You know, since you were talking about the bouquets at the back of the book, are those some combinations that you put together yourself? Are those things that you found in your research in some of the Victorian art that you were looking at? And I was just curious about that because it's such a wonderful, inspirational way to show people how to be able to use the language that you've been presenting through the rest of the book.
Yeah, definitely. So it's actually a little bit of both. So one example that comes like directly from a primary source document would be the bouquet for marriage. So that's this one here. And so if you can find just by Googling the first Language of Flowers book, La Langage des Fleurs, you can find a page that says a bouquet for love, like amour, in the original French. And it includes the red roses. It includes ivy for fidelity and attachment, myrtle for hope and love and marriage. And I added some dahlias into mine. I think for a little bit extra color, and dahlias mean commitment and eternal love, which sort of takes it into more of marriage territory. And so to sort of separate that, we do have another bouquet that's for courting, which is sort of an assemblage of more wildflowers and things like that, like the cornflowers, roses, sweet william, and honeysuckle. And so that sort of is a less serious than a marriage sort of bouquet. I figured it might be kind of interesting in today's world, you know, where people aren't meeting and then getting married a week later, that, you know, you might have a different sort of bouquet for when you're spending a lot of time with someone that you care about instead. So they're a little bit of a combination of both.
I think that's pretty great. You might even need to create a bouquet for those poor brides that have had to postpone their weddings for a year. And maybe fidelity becomes even more important, or patience, I don't know which, but maybe you'll have to come up with a bouquet for that too.
Oh, I can't imagine. That must be so tough.
Oh man, I'm sure it is. One of the things I noticed in some of your bouquets is that some of the flowers don't necessarily bloom all at the same time. So do you think, so is that part of your artistic creation to make these beautiful, or do you think during the Victorian era, I know crafts were such a popular part of the Victorian period, do you think people were drying flowers and then creating these with dried flowers, or do you think they were all fresh bouquets? Because I also know that greenhouses were at their peak during the Victorian era for buying exotic plants, you know, that could be readily available anytime.
Yeah, I think that's really sort of the start of where you would see more exotic flowers being brought in. And I think when we think about Victorian England, specifically cities like London, or if we think about Paris, it's sort of an industrial landscape all of a sudden. And so, you know, they might not have access to growing things themselves, but there were city florists that they could go to, or they could practice drying them themselves, which were very popular. You see that a lot in some of the lasting Victorian art that we have. I have like a little cloche jar behind me that has some dried flowers and like a butterfly in it. It's very Victorian feeling because that was so popular. And so I think with today, especially, you really can kind of find flowers from a florist or from even the grocery store. Like, I don't know a time when our grocery store doesn't have like zinnias and eucalyptus like year round. It's kind of amazing that we have such access to this. And so I think it would be great for today if you look in your own garden and see what you do have, and then sort of go from there and see what you can make with that. Personally, I wish I could grow all of the flowers in this book, but I do live in a very hot place, so it's not always possible to get all the ones I would like.
Do you have a big flower garden yourself, though, too, so that you have samples right at the ready when you want them?
I try to. We have a bunch of stuff growing right now. It's sort of been strange because we had a second bloom on our cherry tree last week, which is just really bizarre. So I have that. I love planting bulbs in the fall that grow in the spring. That's like my favorite thing, because you just leave them and you forget about them. And it's so low maintenance. Like, you don't have to think about watering them, and they just pop up after a cold winter. It's amazing. So I have tons of tulips, tons of daffodils, like all sorts of daffodils. They're one of my favorites. I have some irises that I also need to put some bulbs in the ground. I should have done that a little bit earlier, but I'm sure they'll still be fine. I have Persian lilies that I love. They grow really tall. They're these like gorgeous deep purple. They almost look like a massive lily of the valley, but purple. They're very, very cool. And so that's one of my favorite things to do. And then in my little front garden bed, I just try to switch things out, every season with some different flowers. So it's been great. It's really fun. I love experimenting with bulbs and seeing like what'll actually come up and grow. I know here we do have some trouble in the summer when it gets really, really hot. Things just kind of bake in the sun, which is, the most disappointing thing. I grew a bunch of things from seed this year, and then a lot of them ended up getting fried in the sun if I didn't water it just one day, which is, it happens. So I should
Well,
really,
that means you're a totally dedicated gardener. If you don't mind if something fries in the sun, you have to just keep trying, make it all work for sure.
Yeah.
But your pictures are everlasting. That's the best part about them. So,
Yeah.
And I do know that even dried flower arrangements or pressed flowers on a note card is another way to be able to use the inspiration from your book, or the old tinsel backed pictures, that were reverse painting on glass that the Victorians loved to do. I've seen many period pieces, that are bouquets, and I'm sure that was part of all this floriography that you've discovered and really unrevealed. How did you do all of your research for each one of the flowers?
Yeah, so I just started, there's some that I knew automatically. So I have like a little bit of a background in mythology and folklore, just because it's what interests me. It's not really anything to do with my own personal work, but it's just something that I like. I do remember reading about Narcissus in my 10th grade English class. And so that's the genus for a daffodil. And so that's one that comes right from Greek mythology. I love that one.
Tell us that story, because it's a wonderful story.
Sure. So the Greek legend of Narcissus, from which the scientific name of this plant derives, tells of a handsome and proud hunter who, upon seeing his reflection in the waters of a spring, falls in love with himself. Unable to part from his own image, he eventually perishes. A daffodil then blooms to mark his grave. And so that one's for unrequited love. So I love that one. It's one of my favorite colors of the daffodils that they come in instead of the bright yellow. This is like my absolute favorite. So whenever I would do an illustration, I always pick my favorite color of the flower that it comes in. And then with others that I did not know about, I would just start with a simple search for it. It's pretty easy to find Kate Greenaway's 1884 Language of Flowers just online. And so I'd start with, okay, let's say, I'll pick one of here. Like hyssop means cleanliness. And so I might type just that into Google. and see what would come up to try to see that. And then if I really couldn't find anything with that, I would start typing in just the name of the flower plus folklore plus mythology, religion, culture, and sort of go from there to try to see. And then I have a bunch of books on flower history that I would refer to if Google failed me, which it did on many an occasion researching this. And, you know, there are some where it's just, we don't know why it was named that and or why the meaning comes from that. Like one example is a petunia. And I mean, I couldn't not include a petunia in this book, even though I couldn't find much out about it. And it means anger and resentment. And so there's little recorded about it. I know from growing them myself, they're sensitive. They're pretty easily damaged. They get like these tears and rips in them if it's like windy slightly. And so, you know, sensitive and easily damaged might relate back to anger and resentment. And so there are some where florists in the Victorian era would get a new flower in and they might make up a meaning to sell it, to say, oh, we just got this one in. Do you know what it means? You know? And so some of those might still be around. And then with others, they have multiple meanings. And so I would really try to go down the path and find the meaning that I think had maybe the coolest origin story, the best myth to me, because there were so many conflicting ones. And so it's sort of, you know, kind of I wrote this in sort of little bite-sized pieces. And so we're not going to go into ones that have 50 different meanings. But, you know, there were about 100 different language of flowers books existing around the same time in this era. And so it can be difficult to track this stuff down. And it took a lot of research and a lot of time, but it was definitely worth it. It was a lot of fun to do, really.
How many years did it take for you to put this whole book together?
So I started writing a book proposal for this in 2018. And so I showed that to my literary agent, Alyssa, who is fantastic and I adore her. And I was like, you know, what do you think about this? Like, could I potentially make this into a book? And she was really, really encouraging. She definitely helped out a lot. She came up with doing the pair widths in here, which I think really does help separate it from a lot of other existing language of flower books. And those are just little suggestions that sort of go back to the tussy-mussies that they would give and make in the Victorian era, you know, when you combine 2 or 3 flowers together to give it a more enhanced or more significant meaning. And so from there, we sort of like put together a dream list of who we would want to make this book, who we would want to work with. And then she started sending those like inquiries out in 2019. And so Andrews McNeil, who is my publisher, decided that they would want to make this into a book with me, which is so thrilling. And so then with my book proposal, it was really, I had done 5 flowers and 1 bouquet. And so then I needed to do the other 95 flowers and 9 other bouquets. So then I really kind of went into a serious work mode once I had signed that contract. And I started by doing the research and the writing first. I started by making a big list of all the flowers that I thought would be interesting to include. And then I'd sort of narrow it down after doing more research on the flower, because I definitely didn't want to have 100 flowers that all came from Greek mythology. So I really wanted some varied meanings, varied origin stories. And also I wanted to do, you know, include some herbs in there, include flowers that look different from one another, lots of different colors, and lots of different meanings, because it would be so boring if they all meant love or romance or something like that. And so I definitely tried to include more of like the witchy, more of the mean, more of like just interesting ones to me.
So you could get the whole variety of feelings and emotions out there. And I think it's perfect to launch it in this time when everybody's emotions are so varied and so extreme all the way around. We're almost out of time, but I have one more question to ask you, Jessica, before we ask the audience for their questions. So I do hope everybody puts a nod to that ask a question button on the bottom of the screen and helps us with some more questions. But I'm wondering what kind of medium you use, or how did you do this? Is this watercolor? Is it marker? Is it pen and ink?
Sure.
How do you create this beautiful artwork?
let me grab a pile of drawings really fast. Hang on, so I can show you some originals. Okay, so I definitely should have put this on my desk before we started. But so this is all the originals from the book.
Incredible.
And so what I start out with is doing a graphite pencil drawing. So this is one for Apple Blossom. And so it's
Beautiful.
just black and white, and I tend to sharpen my pencil an awful lot. And so this really helps sort of set up the value, like the pattern from light to dark. And it also helps me get really, really detailed. And so then I will take that in and scan it and put that into Photoshop or a program called Procreate. And I color digitally underneath the pencil drawing. So let me see if I can pull up. Yeah. So then it turns into that.
Beautiful.
Yeah.
So it's a combination of digital drawing, digital coloring, and hand drawing.
Yep. A little bit of
Only
both
those
traditional
could
and
be
digital.
produced in 2020, right? Rather than 1995.
Definitely.
It's pretty remarkable. I really do
Thank you.
admire so much your talent and your creativity and your book. And I honestly hope that in addition to the book, somebody will offer you a chance to show these in a gallery somewhere, because
that would be
they
fantastic.
certainly
Yeah.
are gorgeous, and they're worthy of a gallery showing for sure.
Oh, thank
Now,
you.
I'm just wondering whether Jennifer would like to join us again. And I believe we do have some questions, Jennifer. So maybe you can
Yes.
help me by asking those questions.
I
You're
would
so
be
good with the
delighted to.
technology. I didn't want to be responsible for this part.
Sometimes it works more smoothly than other times, let me just say. Before I start the questions, I just have to say, so delightful to kind of just wallow in your expertise and your enthusiasm for this subject. And I'm going to be honest with you, I'm not like a flower and plant person. I tell people never give me a house plant because it's like a death sentence. But even I was hanging on every word. So thank you so much for sharing with us tonight. And I know the audience is having a great time too. And let's see what their questions are. Okay, Katrina would like to know. She says, thank you for this. In your floriography research, did you find any overlap between flower meanings and ways in which they were used in historical medicinal tonics or apothecary shops?
Yeah, there's a lot. My dad is a doctor, and when I showed him this book, he went through it and he was like, that's a medicinal one. That's a medicinal one. It was really great because he has that experience. And so I know belladonna comes up a lot. There's a lot of like poisoning kind of ones like that. Here's that one. It goes by the name of deadly nightshade, and it means silence. And so it was commonly used as a poison, thus causing death and silencing the victim forever. And the genus Atropa, it's Atropa belladonna, is named for the Greek goddess Atropos, the oldest of the three fates, who is known for cutting the thread of life and ending the lives of mortals. And so it sort of all kind of loops back together with the mythology, with medicinal usage. I know yarrow's another big one in here. So there's so many, medicinal plants. Yeah. Oh, yeah.
That's fascinating.
Definitely, yeah. Wormwood's in there too, yeah. So there's a lot of overlap there, and a lot of the meanings come directly from their medicinal usage. Tansy is another one, yeah.
Oh, that's fascinating. Good question, Katrina, and the other two people who voted for that one. Michael, what are your thoughts on the recent interest in the language of flowers in theater, like the show Enola Holmes mystery series?
Yeah, I love that. I just watched that. When it came out, a bunch of people texted me and tweeted at me. They were like, you have to watch the show. And so I've noticed the language of flowers coming up in pop culture pretty frequently. I know if you're a fan of Harry Potter, it comes up in the naming of characters. It comes up in the potions classes. And then in Enola Holmes, it's, they have the language of flowers literally incorporated into the show. But if you pay attention to the clothing that they're wearing, in one scene, a character is wearing a dress of pansies. They're little pansies embroidered on black silk. And so I don't want to spoil it. It happens at the end. So just watch that and then look at the book to see the meaning, because then you'll really understand it a bit more. There's a pressed cornflower in one scene there as well. I love that movie. It was just fantastic. And so I think it's really a cool way that you can like subtly gesture to people who have a background in it to be like, oh yeah, I know what that flower means, you know. I do see it a lot in naming of characters and that sort of thing as well.
That's very cool. And I just want to jump in here and say the questions have generally been directed to Jessica, but Cindy, of course, if you have something to add or want to jump in, please do, okay?
No problem. Jessica's doing a great job.
Oh, thank you.
Mallory, my colleague at the Mark Twain House, and I think you both know Mallory, wants to know for both of you, if you could put together your perfect bouquet, which flowers would you choose? Also, Jessica, your book is absolutely gorgeous.
Thank you. Do you want to go first, Cindy?
No, you go first and then I'll follow. Mine will pale compared to yours.
Oh man, it's so hard to pick. I would definitely put in ferns because you got to have some greenery in there. And I love the secrecy and magic meaning behind that. Proteas are another one of my favorite flowers. They look great in a bouquet because they're massive. They're big, big flowers. And so you sort of, whenever I'm thinking about constructing a bouquet, I kind of do one big thing, lots of greenery, and then little smaller flowers that sort of accentuate it around it. Passion flowers are really cool. They're the state wildflower of Tennessee. And so they grow wild here. Yeah. Not a lot of people know that. Aren't they crazy looking? So they're a little bit smaller and they come in like this white, and they also come in a really interesting purple color. I love orange blossoms. I feel like you got to have something in there that makes it smell really nice like that. Yeah, maybe something like that just off the top of my head.
Good job. For me, it's really interesting. You know, I've done so much work in historic landscapes and landscape design and horticulture for historic species to be able to recreate gardens at historic houses and museums and things. And for me, it's really been interesting this year to see the resurgence of things that have not been popular for long periods of time. So things like zinnias are becoming really popular again. And I think some of this is from the cut your own flower garden movement. But zinnias, dahlias, all of a sudden my Twitter is full of dahlia pictures, which offer this huge array of things. I also love Madonna lilies, the great big 6 foot tall white lilies that bloom for about 3 weeks in the summertime and smell incredible. And then Nicotiana, the old fashioned Victorian Nicotiana that's very tall and only smells at nighttime. And I wouldn't put that in a bouquet because it's got very sticky leaves. It's a little bit like picking a petunia to add to a bouquet. But I certainly would make my bouquet out of dahlias and zinnias and lilies, and then add some greenery in there too. But it's really interesting to see the resurgence in popularity in Victorian flowers, along with this interest in their language and their symbology, which I think is really kind of amazing. It's like we're living back in Victorian periods. And I honestly think the stress we're going through right now mimics the Civil War and the years after the Civil War when so many were widowed and life was so difficult for everybody. I feel for the Victorian period right now, and I think there's good reason this will be a really popular book for that reason.
Wow. I have to agree that I've been hearing a lot about zinnias and dahlias myself, particularly on social media. People are putting a lot of photos of those two flowers up. Isn't that fascinating?
Wonderful. Easy to grow. Dependable. Dahlias used to be 6 or 8 feet tall, so they've all been hybridized now to be shorter. But if you look at historic photographs of Victorian gardens, you'll see these giant tall plants in the background, and they're either hollyhocks or dahlias, but usually they're dahlias. And they you can still find them, but they have these big platter dahlias. And the goal was to try to grow as big a dahlia head as you possibly could. So the horticulturists that emerged in the Victorian period also had floral competitions and exhibitions where they would try to show off their best lilies or zinnias or dahlias or some of the annuals that came onto the market then. But it's amazing to me how dahlias have become so popular now. Yeah, it's great.
Yeah, we got to get those giant ones back. Yeah.
Oh, yes.
I know.
Yeah.
I need some giant dahlias outside my house.
Yes, you do.
Tell everyone what I'm about.
Yes. Plant them next to sunflowers. You'll be all set. You'll have enough for another book.
Well, speaking of which, I was going to save this one for the end, but several people would like to know, including, well, including John Pascal. Is there a sequel in the works? Are you working on a sequel to Floriography?
I'm not currently, but I have some ideas in the works of what I could do next. I do really love drawing flowers, but I also really love doing animals and interesting things like that. So maybe we can do something combining my two loves. So I don't want to say too much yet because I'm working on another book proposal at the moment, but I think it'll be really interesting to see, what I'm doing next. And I'm also work on kids' books and lots of other different projects. So those are always exciting as well.
Oh, wow. Good for you.
Fun.
Carol Nicotera, who's one of our awesome, I'm sorry, I said Nicotera. Anyway, Carol was one of our awesome volunteers, and she wants to know, I noticed the black backgrounds on many of your pieces. I'm wondering if you were inspired by Mrs. Delaney, who began her Floriography at the age of 72 in England. All of her works have black backgrounds. Her work is in the British Museum. Do you know her, and is that familiar to you?
Yeah, the name sounds very familiar. So when I use the black backgrounds in my work, I generally try to assign those to flowers that have darker meanings, sort of in a sort of conceptual way like that. But I do think they make really stunning backdrops. You can really see the contrast. I'll have to look that up, though. That sounds incredible. Definitely up my alley.
When I draw and I have to color in landscape plans, I always find when I add the black, it makes the color stand out stronger too.
Yeah,
there's something about the negative space that just really makes the color pop more too.
Well, Carol does lovely floral arrangements for our museum center, so she knows what she's talking about. And she says the biography is Mrs. Delaney, Her Life and Her Flowers. So there you go. Thanks,
that
Carol.
sounds amazing.
This is a good question from Stay. Was the knowledge of flowers common enough that generally everyone would recognize what someone meant if they gave them a bouquet?
Yeah, that's a great question. And so it depends. Generally, this would have been something that wealthier people would be able to participate in. If you were a working class person in Victorian society, you would not generally have access or money to really spend on this sort of thing. And so the knowledge of the language of flowers was really something that was talked about in popular culture. And as we know, people with money get to have the say and, that sort of thing. So they would be able to communicate more with that than, say, someone who would work as like a chimney sweep or something like that, right? But the knowledge of certain ones would be very common, sort of like today we know that red roses mean love, like it would be the same thing. For that, you'd probably know the meaning of flowers that you would see often. Buttercups is another one where, it means you're radiant with charm. And that actually originated in the Victorian era of a game that we still do today, where you hold the buttercup under your chin, and if it glows yellow, it means you like butter. So there's actually little air pockets in the petals of that make it so radiant and shiny. But that would be something that originated from the Victorian era. We still practice today, that people still sort of know the meaning of.
Oh, that's amazing. So Peter
Tell me-
Roux, I'm sorry, Cindy. Go ahead.
I only have one more question. I'm sorry to interrupt you. Remind me the meaning of violets and pansies. Do you have both in the book or just?
They're both in the book.
Yeah. What about violets? And the only reason I'm asking this is that I know that one of the other favorite things to do was to decorate with flowers in food. So any of the edible flowers that were available, if you wanted to really set a wonderful table for afternoon tea or for a luncheon for ladies, then they would often candy the violets and then use them on cakes and pastries and cookies and things. And it's because they're edible. And I just wondered what the violet meant. I can't remember now off the top of my head.
Sure. So violets mean modesty. It was the original flower of Valentine's Day because it was said that Saint Valentine, who was jailed for attempting to spread Christianity, would crush violets to make ink to write letters with in his cell. And so he would write from your Valentine in the violet dyed ink. So that's the flower for that. I love violets. My whole yard blooms with violets in March, and it is just my favorite thing. It was such a surprise. We bought the house in summer, and so I had just missed, the big bloom. And so when March rolled around and the yard just like erupted in white and purple violets, it was just the most amazing and stunning thing.
Wow.
And it's one of the equalizer plants because you can, everybody can enjoy them, and they are wild, and you can find them even on the roadside. The other thing that happened in the Victorian era that links to this in a way is botanizing. So even for those that did not have a lot of money, the idea that you as a mother, if you had some time, would take your children out for a walk because walking and getting outside was healthy. Compared to being inside with all of the gases from these new furnaces that the houses were getting, or the coal stoves. So people would go botanizing, and they would it was basically taking a walk and looking for flowers along the way. But many would press the flowers, or they would understand and key them out so that they could learn more about wildflowers. So even writers like Hawthorne, who was poor as a church mouse when he started, has these quotes about he and his new wife going out botanizing around the old manse and finding wildflowers in bloom, and then creating their own meanings between each other because they found these on a special trip that they took while they were out.
Oh,
Yeah, and if you couldn't afford the flowers themselves, you could also do like postcards and printed matter. So you can still find a lot of these postcards in antique stores today. And they will oftentimes have a bouquet and have the meaning underneath it as well. They're pretty easy to find. I would definitely encourage people to go out and look for them because there's a lot out there, even here in the U.S.
That's great. Really great.
That's a good tip, especially as we head into winter. That's a great idea.
Mm-hmm.
So Peter Roux, our director, who we met a few moments ago, I'm kind of curious to know why he wants to know this, but he says the fact that a petunia could mean anger and resentment was a surprise. Are there other flowers that have negative connotations other than deadly nightshade?
Oh, definitely. Lavender is another one that means distrust. Very interesting too, because it's like that's such a beautiful, beautiful flower that we see. Let's see, there's lavender.
It smells so nice in your laundry.
I know. It's great, right? And so for it to mean distrust, it's like that's a little bit disappointing. Nettle means cruelty, which you can kind of just tell from the look of a nettle that it's probably not going to have a great meaning. Like thistle is in a similar boat. There are others that, like asphodel, that means my regrets will follow you to the grave, that sort of have sadder meanings as well. So there's a whole mix of different, meanings and flowers in here.
Fascinating. Well, I'm just going to make sure we're not missing anybody's question. Well, yeah, let's do you guys want to do a few more? Or are you running out of steam?
Sure, yeah.
Good. So
Why not?
Stay, once again, his sister Lindy wants to know what's the most unusual origin story you've heard?
Ooh, good question. There's some, this is one that both my mom and my husband make fun of constantly, and now they just like say it to me, which is oleander. Oleander means caution. It's not a plant that you really want to get close to. It's kind of pretty toxic and poisonous. And so this comes from the cautionary Greek myth of Hero and Leander. The two were in love, and although they lived on opposite sides of the sea, Leander would swim across every night to visit Hero. One night, during a violent storm, Leander died trying to swim to his love in the rough waters. When Hero saw Leander's body washed ashore, she called out, "O Leander, and drowned herself to be with him in death. And so now, my mom and my husband, whenever they see this one, they go, "Oh Leander," and to me. And it's just like, oh my gosh, guys, really. It's one of those ones that sticks out to me in kind of a sad but kind of funny way. Is that a little mean?
Well, I'll tell a story about asters because my garden's full of asters right now. And of course, the wild asters are blooming here in New England. And the myth that I understand is that the goddess Astoria supposedly wept, and wherever her tears fell, asters grew. So aster is one of those plants that has, it's native to almost every continent in the world. there is an aster that is native to that continent. So when I see them blooming, that's the story that comes to my mind. I don't have oleander in the garden, so I can't have as much
Yeah.
fun with that. But I do think about that story for sure.
Oh, Samantha wants to know, in the book, is there also a discussion of the number of flowers as it relates to meaning, such as two, I think, roses meaning recent death, but one meaning love?
Yeah, I didn't try to get too much into that. I tried to keep it pretty simple in terms of meanings and things like that. So I would really only keep it to one, and essentially just what the general vibe from that flower would be in that time. So I really didn't get too deep into it, but it does get significantly more complicated the more you look into it and research it. There's always things to learn and to find out about with that.
Oh, fascinating. So I just want to point out in the chat, my colleague Mallory in our curatorial team has pointed out that Sam Clemens and his daughter Susie dressed up as Hero and Leander.
Oh, I love that.
Thank you, Mallory, for that. Oh. Now, I don't know that you've directly addressed this, but Judith Lohman wants to know, did men participate in the language of flowers, or was it a female thing exclusively?
Yeah, men definitely participated in it. They would want to give flowers to their loves and express things that way because that's what the women would want. And so definitely, and Victorian culture was really about etiquette and modesty, and you would want to be polite. And so knowing what flower that you should bring as a guest coming into someone's home would be important to know. Just so you wouldn't insult someone or show up empty-handed when you're coming to court your girl. So you would definitely want to know and want to participate in that.
That makes sense. Well, for our final question, Sam Nystrom has asked, I think you've addressed how you went about picking the flowers to include, but he wants to know, are there any flowers that you didn't get to include that you wish you could have for whatever reasons?
There are so many. Yeah. Oftentimes when I'm like going to like the garden center and going to look at different flowers, I'll be like, man, that would have been a really good one to include, just something that's sort of interesting. I know I have celosias growing out in my garden now. Those are so cool. And then there's just certain ones where I was just getting dead ends on meanings and things like that. So I just ended up leaving them out. It's been so long since I compiled all the research. I don't have any that are coming directly to mind. But anything that I'm growing here myself that I didn't do the research for and that I don't know the meaning of, I'm like, man, I really should dig into that and figure it out.
Again, a sequel, I think.
Yeah. I mean, there's so many flowers. There's plenty of opportunity to really do 100 more, and I would not get tired of it.
I bet geranium might have been one of them, Jessica,
Yeah,
was it?
definitely.
I was just thinking about geranium because they were so popular then, too.
They were, yeah. Mm-hmm. Yep. I think that's one of the ones that had several different threads to follow, and it was just like, how do you pick which one to really narrow it down to? There were some where I tried to include both if they were like short enough stories where they could really be included, but there were others where I just sort of went with the one that had the most interesting story, like for example Iris. They also mean a message. That's like a really common one. That's one you would see if you watched Enola Holmes as another meaning, which I think comes from the goddess of the rainbow in Greek mythology. So it's like a message. I think that was kind of just boring. And the other like alternate meanings were like faith, valor, and love maybe. And so it had like sort of this like 3-pronged meaning with like the 3 petals of an iris. So I thought that would be just a more interesting one. And also they were both just as popular as the other. So it's like, you may as well just pick one.
That's great.
Oh my goodness, Cindy and Jessica, thank you so much for this delightful evening. I want to remind people that Jessica's book is available for purchase in our museum store. There's a link in the chat, also a calendar based on Floriography. And people have been asking about the signed copies. Yes, these are signed copies. Jessica has signed book plates, correct?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
And those will be affixed to the books before shipping. So, and of course, your purchase through the museum store benefits the Mark Twain House and Museum. So we appreciate that very much. So both of you, I want to extend an invitation for the day when we can all gather in person. I'd like you to come to Hartford. Hartford is home to Elizabeth Park, which is the nation's oldest municipal rose garden. And it's not just roses, they've got gardens of all kinds that I'm sure you know about. And gorgeous, just down the street from the Mark Twain House. And then our master gardeners and volunteers maintain beautiful, beautiful plantings and gardens on our site itself, as does our neighbor, the Harriet Beecher Stowe Center. So let's come when we can, make a day of it, and look at all the flowers, and you can tell us what they mean and how important they are. Oh my goodness. So thank you so much, and thank you to our audience. And this is one of our most wonderful evenings. I think everybody's had a great time. So thank you for joining us. And audience, let's give a big virtual round of applause for Cindy and Jessica. And we hope we'll be back, and we'll see you again soon.
Well, I hope that this is beneficial for you, and I hope that you all take care in this pandemic. And I really appreciate being asked to do this, Jessica. I had a wonderful time. It was just a joy to be able to interview you for this. So thanks for the opportunity.
This is so much fun. Yeah, thank you.
That's great.
All right. Well, don't be strangers. And now I'm going to go water my plants.
Yes, always a good idea.
All green thumbs from here on out.
Yeah.
Yeah. I'll keep you posted.
Yeah, definitely.
All right.
Bye-bye.
I'm going to close our broadcast, and remember that you can watch it anytime you like, and you can continue the conversation in the chat area. So we'll see you again soon, everybody, and thank you all so much. Good night.
Bye-bye.
Bye, and thank you.